Welcome to the Arms Control Primer, a podcast by the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I am your host, Alex Bollfrass, the head of strategy, technology, and arms control, based in Berlin. On each episode, we welcome the world's leading experts in arms control to share their knowledge and assessments on the most critical issues. Whether you are new to the topic or need a refresher, please join us in our exploration of the nuclear past, present, and future. In this season, we examine the histories and policies of countries that may have had nuclear weapons ambitions or even nuclear arsenals and gave them up. We search for lessons for non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament. I hope it helps you better know a non-nuke.
We have a situation where we don't have enough insight into what's actually happening in Iran's nuclear program on the ground. We have a situation where war is still looming and attacks could happen at any time. And in a situation where, in fact, we are entering the next step of escalation with the reimposition of sanctions and past nuclear-related resolutions with snapback without any kind of clear indication of how we could really resolve the issue.
I think what's more likely is that you're going to see a domestic hardening within Iran, which might make diplomacy more difficult, and also an effort to explore ways of reconstitution, while also being incredibly concerned about an Israeli ability to keep an eye on Iran's nuclear program.
Kicking off this season of the Arms Control Primer, we invited two experts to discuss the Iranian nuclear file. The 12-day conflict in June 2025 between Israel and Iran set the world on edge, especially when the U.S. joined to target Iran's underground nuclear infrastructure. The activation of the snapback mechanism for sanctions on Iran calls for the need to revisit the controversial Iranian nuclear program. Here to share their insights are Dr. Nicole Grajewski and Dr. Azadeh Zamirirad.
I'm Nicole Grajewski. I'm a fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I mostly focus on Iran and Russia, Iran's nuclear program and Russia's role in it, but also broader dynamics with Iran's missile force. And then I also focus on Russian nuclear strategy and Russian role in the non-proliferation regime. Iran started thinking about a nuclear program under the Shah, so prior to the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Iran was one of the countries that signed up for the Atoms for Peace initiative, and the Shah really saw civilian nuclear energy as a prestige symbol. After the fall of the Shah and the establishment of the Islamic Republic, Iran quickly became involved in the Iran-Iraq War. So previous nuclear power plants that were under construction, like the Bushehr nuclear power plant, were halted, actually targeted during the Iran-Iraq War. However, once the Iran-Iraq War ended, and actually during the later stages of this, Iran was already thinking about potentially having a covert nuclear program. There was outreach to countries like even Argentina and China to see if they could assist with Iran's civilian nuclear program, while there was also indications of potential hedging on terms of the weaponization front. Eventually, Iran managed to get cooperation with the Russians, who rebuilt a nuclear power plant in southern Iran called Bushehr, and this was the one that was targeted. The contract was previously awarded to a German company. Germany did not want to be involved in Iran, partly due to the sanctions, and so Iran found its options pretty limited in terms of who could rebuild its nuclear program, at least on the civilian nuclear energy front. And this also was a lot of pressure from the United States to dissuade countries from cooperating. At the same time, while this was happening, Iran was trying to get a covert centrifuge program through the AQ-Khan network, and this is where a lot of the current day Iranian nuclear program starts. This is where this effort of evading controls and sanctions of this whole saga with Iran's covert nuclear program started, and that was around 2002 with the revelations at Natanz, where satellite imagery disclosed that Iran had been operating a covert nuclear program that they had not disclosed to the international community. Within that time period, there was multiple efforts at trying to have a solution to Iran's nuclear program. Eventually, this culminated in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA in 2015. At that time, that placed certain limits on Iran's ability to enrich at the enrichment levels, most intrusive inspection regime. But the Trump administration withdrew from it in 2018. And since then, we've seen this rapid expansion of Iran's nuclear program, all while the verification mechanisms have greatly declined. And this is in the prelude to the June 2025 strikes called Operation Rising Lion by Israel. But this expansion of Iran's nuclear program provided Iran with a lot of know-how, including work with higher enrichment levels. And this was one of the concerns because enrichment becomes progressively easier as it goes up in scale. Iran was enriching up towards a close level of weapons grade uranium and also working with advanced centrifuges that could potentially be used for military purposes. Today, a lot of these facilities that were of concern have been destroyed in strikes, but Iran still retains not only the knowledge, but also a stockpile of highly enriched uranium in Isfahan that was not destroyed in the strikes.
I'm Dr. Azadeh Zamirirad from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. I'm the head of the Africa and Middle East Research Division at SWP, and I'm an Iran researcher working on Iran's nuclear file for around 20 years now. It's been a long time and it's a never-ending story, but I'm very happy to be here today. The enrichment question for Iran goes far beyond just mere cost-benefit calculations. We've seen a lot of states, when they pursue nuclear weapons, not necessarily always following a cost-benefit calculation, and there are other factors at play. I think for Iran, mastering the fuel cycle has been an essential part and core element of Iranian nuclear discourse for far over a decade. You remember former Iranian President Ahmadinejad, after Iran managed to enrich uranium to 20% for the first time, declaring that Iran was now a nuclear state, shows how closely Iranian identity in terms of the Islamic Republic had been intertwined with the nuclear program. There is part of a sunk cost fallacy at play here with the massive investment that Iran has undertaken over the years, that it's very difficult to give up overall. But there's also this identity dimension, this dimension of having this kind of status as a nuclear state, as Ahmadinejad defined it, or at least declared it, that comes with a certain global status, a global posture that was very important to the Islamic Republic. There was this very strong motive of independence. We had Supreme Leader Khamenei over the years compare the nuclear file to the oil industry, saying it would be bizarre if we weren't allowed to have our own refineries and produce our own oil and gas. So if we have a nuclear program, we need to be able to produce and enrich our own uranium instead of importing it and depending on other actors to deliver these kind of materials. It has been also a question of scientific progress that has been a main motive for Iran to position itself as a country on the global scale that is at the forefront of scientific progress and one of the most complicated, most sophisticated endeavors in that regard from Iran's perspective. And the question where Iran for years at least thought it would also be one that would position Iran in a unique phase where it would be accepted at least, regardless of whether there would be positive acceptance or negative acceptance, but acknowledged as a major power on the global scale.
Nicole Grajewski continues the story about Iran's covert nuclear weaponization activities and the diplomatic efforts aimed at countering them.
After the revelations about Iran's covert nuclear facilities, there was an effort by the Europeans to engage diplomatically with Iran. This culminated in an agreement in 2004 about Iran halting enrichment. However, that never really occurred because by 2005, Iran already reneged on that promise. And you see the rise of Ahmadinejad, who was Iran's very bombastic president, who frequently would use the nuclear program as a way to threaten the West and really showed no will to cooperate with the international community. And as a result, Iran experienced a series of punitive measures, including economic sanctions, military sanctions, and multilateral sanctions on its program via the UN. The IAEA did a comprehensive report in 2011, which revealed a lot of Iran's covert weaponization or potential military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program that was existing mostly prior to 2003, though there were some efforts after 2003. And this included work on actually having an implosion-type bomb, work with neutron generators, and a lot of work in terms of the weaponization aspect of the nuclear program. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that Iran stopped this after 2003 as a result of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. But there was aspects of this program that remained intact institutionally and some dual-use research. Iran did have the kind of knowledge of working with fashioning fissile material into a nuclear device, or at least some of the early stages of that, which could potentially lead to a nuclear weapon. So prior to the JCPOA, Iran was experiencing an endemic economic crisis and a hardline president, Ahmadinejad. And then in 2013, Hassan Rouhani, who was former secretary of the Supreme National Security Council and also a nuclear negotiator during the previous rounds of talks with the Europeans, was elected as president. And Rouhani came to power with the promise of at least finding some solution to the nuclear program and to the economic situation in Iran. This eventually resulted in the 2003 JPOA, which was a joint plan of action. And this was a result of negotiations between the US, the Europeans, so that was the European Union, but also France, England, and Germany, and also Russia and China. And so this provided a framework which would evolve into the JCPOA.
What we saw back then, though, was a massive European effort to find a political solution to the Iran nuclear crisis. And that culminated in the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear agreement of 2015, which I still believe to be a milestone of non-proliferation. Despite all of its shortcomings, I think the JCPOA had a lot to offer and was actually working quite well for the first couple of years when everybody was still complying with its obligations under the JCPOA, mainly because it was resting on two major pillars. One was the very severe technical limitation of Iran's nuclear program and activities, which brought us a breakout time of at least 1 year. So Iran would have needed at least 1 year to produce enough nuclear weapons-grade fissile material to actually build a single bomb. And on top of that, we had a very stringent, very strict verification monitoring regime in place. In fact, the most extensive one that we've seen ever imposed on an NPT member state. And these two pillars were quite strong in terms of dealing with Iran, the nuclear program, at that point in time.
One of the parts of the JCPOA that we see actually playing out today is the snapback mechanism. The word snapback is not written within the JCPOA, but if Iran was found in significant non-performance of its obligations, the remaining parties of the JCPOA could reinstate multilateral sanctions on Iran. And this was done through a bunch of diplomatic loopholes and intricate wording that were promoted by the Russians that meant that neither Russia nor China could veto any additional efforts to reimpose sanctions on Iran. And this helped assuage some of the U.S. concerns about Iranian compliance with the deal, but also U.S. domestic pressures, specifically within Congress. This meant that there wouldn't have to be a renewal every 6 months or a year when it came to the JCPOA. There were quite a bit of critiques from Israel and from within the United States, and it actually transcended party lines at times. The major critique was that there were sunset provisions, that certain limitations on Iran's nuclear activities would lapse in a period of time, and that didn't call for the complete eradication of some of Iranian nuclear capabilities or nuclear activities. That was the main one when it came to technical issues. The other one was about the weakness of Section T. Section T in the JCPOA dealt with weaponization activities, and Iran was banned from ever doing these kind of activities. However, I think critics would say that these weren't clarified enough. And there was also the issue of compliance, and that went to all parties. There was no way for the JCPOA to actually remain like this agreement because it was not voted on in the Senate. It was an executive agreement within the United States. There was that compliance issue. And then on top of that, it was a political issue because at the time, Iran was actually involved in bolstering Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. Iran was doing very adversarial activities in Iraq, arming the Houthis. And this didn't really limit Iran's regional activity and its involvement in the region. And it didn't target Iran's ballistic missile program. And this was a big issue because Iran has quite a sophisticated ballistic missile program that could potentially be delivery vehicles for a nuclear weapon. And also, this was what Iran used to terrorize the region. This was a big grouping of issues. It was political, it was technical, and it was also not enough for some.
Now, when things started to fall apart, that's when we saw the Trump administration coming in and deciding in 2018 that this agreement was not strong enough, that it wasn't enough overall because it didn't address important challenges in the security realm. And we then saw the declaration of the so-called maximum pressure policy that was actually intended to get more concessions out of Iran, both on the regional front, but also on the nuclear front. But what we saw instead was that this did not materialize at all. And we saw pretty much the opposite take effect in the sense that Iran, a year later, from 2019 onwards, declared themselves that they would no longer feel obligated to comply with the provisions of the JCPOA. And they openly declared it. They openly started to take the first steps to essentially get rid of any kind of technical limitation that was imposed on Iran in the nuclear agreement of 2015.
The Biden administration came to office saying that they were going to quickly rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. They waited until April of 2021 to resume negotiations with the Iranians. But there was a lot of tension over political issues that seem benign in retrospect. And they didn't really make much progress. It looked like there was about to be progress in January of 2022. It seemed like there was an agreement on the table. There were negotiations in Vienna. There was some kind of agreement where the U.S. would come back and join the JCPOA. But then the war in Ukraine broke out. And essentially, the Iran nuclear issue became hostage to Russia's war. And Russia played a pretty big role in the Iran nuclear program and on the negotiations. And so you saw Iran actually having the Russian support for Iran as a way of shielding itself within the IAEA and in negotiations. And then again, there was negotiations, they continued. And then in August of 2022, there was another indication that potentially there might be some kind of resolution, but then the Mahsa Amini protest broke out. And Iran became much more of a human rights issue than a non-proliferation issue. And these talks unraveled. And then all of this happens, and then we find out that Iran is supplying drones to Russia and Ukraine. And that violated some of the remaining embargoes on Iranian arms that were part of the JCPOA and really cast Iran into a party to the conflict. And so the Iran nuclear issue just became overshadowed by so many other things.
And they also started to significantly decrease their cooperation with the IAEA. It has been a huge problem ever since. We've seen Iran suspend the additional protocol in February of 2021. We've seen Iran remove cameras in different facilities in the summer of 2022. We've seen Iran revoke permits of IAEA inspectors in September of 2023. Now, where there were still cameras in place, there were still inspectors in place, the level of cooperation had been significantly decreased until then. So since 2019, when Iran declared that as a reaction to US withdrawal, they would withdraw from their own obligations.
Trump comes back to the presidency, and Iranians were quite worried that there was going to be another maximum pressure 2.0. There was somewhat of it, but a far less concerted effort than what we saw in the first Trump administration, with really strong embargoes and also sanctions on Iran. The maximum pressure 2.0 under a second Trump administration didn't seem as robust. Trump also indicated early on that he'd be willing to negotiate issues with the Iranians because he was going to have a better deal than the Obama JCPOA. And in March of this past year, the U.S. and Iran started in direct contact with each other. There was letters exchanged about potentially having talks, and we see the resumption of talks through back channels through the Omanis. And it's between Steve Witkoff and the Iranian foreign minister. And it seemed like this was going on a decent trajectory. Trump warned that unless if there was an agreement in 90 days, they would face consequences. Nobody really knew when those 90 days were, whether they were the date that the letter was received or the date that they first met in person. So it was murky in that end. But it seemed like there was at least some momentum towards a solution, though it didn't really necessarily appear that optimal in terms of inspections and verification and also limits. But they were toying with the idea of a regional consortium of measures for Iran to limit its uranium enrichment or the levels of it, some kind of sanctions relief. It wasn't going to be this comprehensive agreement like the JCPOA. However, it was, I believe, in early June, the Iranians and the U.S. were supposed to meet again in Oman on a Sunday. However, that Friday, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, and Iran and the United States did not have the opportunity to complete this diplomatic path that didn't really necessarily show a clear indication of going somewhere, but was nonetheless a bit more constructive than the situation we're in today.
Azadeh Zamirirad turns towards the expansion of the Iranian nuclear program in the run-up to Israel's Operation Rising Lion.
We've seen massive extensions and expansions of Iran's nuclear activities, massive reduction of cooperation with the IAEA. And until 2025, Iran had actually amassed around 9,800 kilograms of enriched uranium. Iran had started to test and experiment with uranium metal. Iran had started to use additional enrichment facilities, advanced centrifuge types, more centrifuges. All of these are violations of what was originally agreed upon And most notably, and this is something that is still a problem for us today, Iran had amassed around 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. So highly enriched uranium, that is a problem and reason for serious concern, which is why in 2025, everybody was expecting some sort of escalation to happen over the summer, because there was a sense of urgency at this point with this rapidly expanding nuclear program. And it culminated in the Israeli government at least taking matters into their own hand by carrying out military strikes on June 13.
It was on the morning of June 13th in Iran. Israel conducted a mass air campaign on Iran, both from within Iran, where they actually penetrated Iran and had Israeli agents basically launching UAVs from Iranian territory onto its own facilities, but also through Israeli fighter jets. And this led to the decapitation of Iran's command and control, but also to key leadership, scientists, and relevant parts of its nuclear program. The initial strikes really focused on the above ground facilities and less so on the big prizes, which were in Natanz and Fordow. And it seemed like Israel was waiting to coax the United States into joining the fight. They really held off on Natanz and Fordow. Both of those facilities are quite heavily insulated, and they did need the bunker busters for that. And it was almost a week into the 12-day war. The U.S. launched around 12 bunker busters at Fordow. On Sunday, June 22, a little more than a week into the 12-day war, the U.S. launched Operation Midnight Hammer. This included 7 B-2 stealth bombers that targeted Iran's nuclear installations at Fordow and Natanz with 14 30,000-pound bombs, while also guided missiles from submarine launched more than 24 cruise missiles at Esfahan, which was Iran's largest nuclear research complex. They penetrated most of Iran's protected facilities, but it didn't result in what the White House claimed as a total obliteration of Iran's capabilities. Then the next day, through actually some back-channel choreographing between the U.S. and the Iranians, Iran retaliated and launched around 14 or so ballistic missiles at the largest U.S. base in Qatar. And eventually they called it quits. And then the ceasefire was announced through the Trump administration, saying that there was a ceasefire, and this is called Operation Midnight Hammer, and we've achieved our goal, and the Israeli fighter jets are turning around, and they're not going to bomb Iran anymore. It was actually quite surprising the way that the war ended, but that was the gist of U.S. involvement.
Now, what does all of this mean for Iran's nuclear program, and what do we know? Well, first of all, we don't know the exact scope of the damage when it comes to the nuclear sites. The IAEA has not been on the ground. There were no in-field verification activities taking place. In fact, the IAEA personnel that was still on the ground in Iran was withdrawn throughout the war by the agency, and nobody has gone back ever since at this point. A number of important facilities in terms of Iran's nuclear infrastructure were targeted, like the Natanz pilot plant for fuel enrichment, the uranium conversion plant in Isfahan, the enrichment plant in Fordow, which was targeted by the United States, as well as the heavy water reactor in Iraq, and other areas that were targeted, the number of nuclear scientists that were killed. And there's this famous saying by al-Baradei that you can't bomb knowledge, but when you have this many nuclear scientists eliminated, it does put a lot of strain on the nuclear program. We don't know how many of the roughly 20,000 centrifuges were actually destroyed. It looks like probably almost all of them have been destroyed. Grossi speaks of severe but not total damage, so we don't know if the entire infrastructure has actually been totally damaged. It looks like this has not been the case. As I said, the IAEA has no in-field verification opportunities at this point and have made it clear that they lost continuity of knowledge with regard to the inventory of nuclear material. We don't know if there have been other additional centrifuges somewhere in place, if there have been other enrichment facilities somewhere in place. That's a very concerning situation to be in. And the most concerning probably is what happened to the 440 kilograms of highly enriched nuclear material, uranium, that had been enriched to 60%, which Iran has not really allowed access to, and we don't know the whereabouts of. We have a situation where we don't have enough insight into what's actually happening in Iran's nuclear program on the ground. We have a situation where war is still looming and attacks could happen at any time. And in a situation where, in fact, we are entering the next step of escalation with the reimposition of sanctions and past nuclear-related resolutions with snapback, without any kind of clear indication of how we could really resolve the issue. So if we take all of this together, I think we have to be far more cautious in calling these kind of attacks successful. I think when we talk about military success in terms of the nuclear program, if you look at it in the short term, you might say, okay, they were quite successful operationally. But in the mid to long term, I'm not sure this is necessarily the case. And what we see at this point is that the infrastructure has not been entirely disrupted and destroyed, meaning that as long as we don't have any new agreement in place or any other type of resolution, further military attacks are likely and maybe even from at least the Israeli point of view, even necessary. So if you get into this dynamic of mowing the lawn over and over again, it becomes a perpetual state and is certainly not any type of sustainable conflict mechanism to resolve the nuclear issue and the non-proliferation challenge that lies ahead of us.
With the reimposition of sanctions on Iran, Nicole Grajewski discusses the aftermath of the strikes and ongoing diplomatic efforts to engage Iran, as well as political dynamics in the country.
Since the end of the 12-day war, the Trump administration really has lost interest in the Iran nuke file. However, the whole summer after the June 12-day war was really about the European effort to use the last lever of influence, which was the ability to invoke snapback sanctions on Iran. Throughout the summer, the UK, France, and Germany engaged with the Iranians on certain principles of either extending snapback or coming to an agreement where they would still retain leverage over the Iran nuclear program. The E3's conditions were pretty much that Iran resumes direct discussions with the US, Iran offers the IAEA access to the nuclear facilities that have been damaged or targeted, and that Iran also offers transparency when it comes to its HEU stockpile. That never really was achieved in the summer. And so at the end of the month, August, the E3 alerted the Security Council that they would be going forward with snapback sanctions. And so that set like a 30-day clock for a solution. And that clock's going to run out where actually sanctions will be automatically reimposed on Iran. So the Iranians say a lot of things. I think that sometimes most inflammatory rhetoric gets picked up by Western analysis, but they've made a ton of threats since the 12-day war. One of the threats was that they would push back on IAEA inspections, and they did that. They invoked a law within the parliament, and it's implemented through the Supreme National Security Council that essentially blocks IAEA access to the country unless the Supreme National Security Council approves it. But they've also made looming threats about withdrawing from the NPT. That has currently been debated within the parliament. It's unclear whether Iran is going to pursue that route, because obviously that might open up the door for further Israeli strikes on Iran, and Iran is by no means in the ideal situation to weather that. Iran also is threatening to create an ICBM. There was parliamentarians claiming that they created ICBMs and they have ICBM capabilities and they tested it. There's also been threats about Iran in terms of what they plan to do in the future with their capabilities or about even acquiring a nuclear weapon. And you hear some hardliners also talking about the possibility of revising the nuclear fatwa to allow for nuclear weapons. And so there's a lot of domestic noise coming out of Iran. It's unclear what Iran's response is going to be to snapback sanctions. To some extent, it seems like Iran might weather it out and try to find another solution. Because in some ways, the existence of the HEU stockpile gives Iran with future bargaining leverage. I think the Iranians are going to try to use that to the best of their abilities.
From the leadership's perspective, in many ways, even though they have suffered massive setbacks on a nuclear front, on a ballistic missile front, and with regard to the security architecture overall that they have, with losing a lot of high-ranking personnel, there's the sense of achievement in terms of withstanding these attacks, in terms of resilience. And that's the general sense in parts of the political elite, who at least try to frame these attacks as some sort of victory. Victory in the sense that resilience was actually shown vis-a-vis Israel and the United States. The fact that Iran was able to withstand military attacks by the most sophisticated military power in the region and certainly the most powerful superpower and military power in the world, the United States. We heard the Supreme Leader in one of his speeches after the war actually try to reframe these attacks by saying that the fact that the United States entered the war by attacking Fordo showed that the Israelis were actually at the brink of failure and the brink of a major loss, and that they actually required US assistance to be able to compete, if you will, with Iran. That's all part of rhetoric, of course. But there is some sense of victory in terms of having been able to withstand this attack, in the sense that the regime is still there. The state is still there and it has not collapsed. The nuclear program has not entirely collapsed. The nuclear infrastructure has not entirely collapsed. And one of the things that part of the elites were worried about, that there might be mass protests now accompanying these kind of military attacks, did not occur. And that is despite the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu, in one of his messages addressing the Iranian population during the war, said that the war was not against the Iranian people and that it would pave the way for them to take matters into their own hand, basically. But this is not what happened on the ground. And this is not due to the fact that the Iranian population as a whole would be standing by the Islamic Republic as a political system, but rather the major concern that large parts of Iranian civil society also, and of major oppositional figures in the system, had concerns about what all of this means for the capacity of society to even carry out protests, and the capacity of civil society in the long run, the economic foundation of this country, the territorial integration and territorial sovereignty of this country. This kind of massive concern and maybe potential risk is one that didn't occur the way that maybe some people outside of Iran were thinking it would. At the same time, when we look beyond the rhetorics and beyond this sense of achievement of withstanding these attacks, what we've seen among the Iranian leadership is massive paranoia. And this has been massively also strengthened by these types of attacks, because we've seen the level of infiltration, we've seen the level and precision of intelligence information that the Israeli security apparatus has gathered over the past years. That was once again evident during these attacks. And this has already materialized in more repression domestically. More than 21,000 people have been arrested who have been accused of collaborating with Israeli security forces. Of course, once again, disproportionately affecting ethnic minorities in Iran, Kurdish people, Baluchi people, also Baha'i religious minorities. We already saw the first set of executions of people who were accused of spying for Israel. So the whole domestic scene has become once more and even more so securitized after these types of attacks. And I think there is the sense in parts of the Iranian leadership that mass protests, as they were evident a couple of years ago with the Women Life Freedom movement, are a core security concern now. There's also just too many fronts that Iran needs to battle at the same time, at this time around. And the Islamic Republic is a country that is very much experienced in dealing with a number of crises, but even for an actor as experienced as the Islamic Republic, there's just too much of an overstretch at this point. And to deal with massive domestic discontent at the same time as you have to deal with massive sanctions, now being probably even strengthened with a looming snapback, and dealing with the nuclear crisis, dealing with the massive weakening of your strongest strategic allies in the region, like Hezbollah in particular, but also Hamas and others, losing your ally in Syria with the fall of Assad. All of these are just too many points, too many battlefronts at once that Islamic Republic cannot handle like that.
Nicole Grajewski shares her thoughts on potential future pathways for Iran's nuclear program.
Iran's thinking prior to the 12-day war, I think, was one of hedging. They had an advanced civilian nuclear program, while also working on several dual-use applications of technology relevant to potential weaponization, and also developing the delivery vehicles and the ballistic missiles that could potentially host a nuclear warhead. Iran was engaged in this multi-tracked strategy where at the broad level in the international community, they portrayed themselves as this victim that was unjustly being targeted to stop their civilian nuclear energy program and the right under the NPT. But then on the other hand, in the shadow realms of Iranian domestic strategy, there was this dual use side of it where you did see applications of weaponization. You saw efforts at obtaining the means to deliver a nuclear weapon. It wasn't clear, though, at the time and prior to the 12-day war, it seemed like they were doing this strategy as a conscious effort. If they made the decision to obtain a nuclear weapon, they could do so on a closer timeline. And so that was the value of the dual use side, or at least what they thought. Obviously, that didn't occur. And if anything, I think Iran's advances in its nuclear program did invite a lot more scrutiny into acquiescence to Israeli strikes. Going forward, there's several ways we can see this playing out. One could be that Iran and the E3 and the US miraculously come up with an agreement that resolves all these outstanding issues that we've discussed during this podcast. That's very unlikely, but there are surprises that have happened in the history of the Iran nuclear issue. I think what's more likely is that you're going to see a domestic hardening within Iran, which might make diplomacy more difficult, and also an effort to explore ways of reconstitution, while also being incredibly concerned about Israeli penetration and Israeli ability to keep an eye on Iran's nuclear program. This might mean going deeper underground. This might be greater efforts at concealing its program and also on a smaller scale. And then the other route, and I think this is also somewhat likely, is a resumption of hostilities between Iran and Israel. And that might be as a result of a lack of progress on diplomatic talks or because Israel detects something. Whatever Israel uses as a justification, we will likely see further tit for tat between Iran and Israel. The nature of it may look a bit different because the Israelis expended quite a bit of their interceptors, and Iran is by no means in the position where it should be if it wants to fight another round of Operation True Promise 4 with the Israelis. I would say that that's like pathways right now. But the one thing with Iran and its nuclear program is there's always these twists and turns. It really seldom gets better for that long.
The future of Iran's nuclear program is actually quite open. I do not see them trying to get back to the status quo ante, or at least being successful in it, because so much had been invested in this broad, decentralized infrastructure for decades. Billions have gone into this program. So I don't think we will have the same scale and bandwidth also with regard to restarting the program to the same extent that we saw in the past. But it is open in the sense that we don't know. And I think there's a serious concern and a serious risk that going nuclear is actually their best shot, and their best shot at deterrence, and their best shot at keeping the system alive in the long run. Whether they will be able to manage to do it is a completely different question, but we might see at least the attempt to try to go into this direction. As to the question of what that means for Iran's theoretical timeline with regards to building nuclear weapons, again, we don't know for sure. There are very broad ranges of estimates, some speaking of maybe the whole military operation has delayed the program by only a couple of months. Some people speak of maybe 1 to 2 years. Overall, what we can say is that there has been massive damage and there have been massive setbacks. This has not been a solution to the nuclear conflict and to the nuclear crisis that we see with Iran. I think this has been evident. And this is a problem because now the conditions for actually trying to come to terms with what we've seen over the summer have become so much more difficult in terms of entering new negotiations.
I also asked Nicole Grajewski for her thoughts on the implications of the fight over the Iranian nuclear program for the global non-proliferation regime.
The non-proliferation regime has been under stress since Russia's war in Ukraine, and even before that, growing divergences amongst the great powers. I think to some countries, this is an indication of the hypocrisy of the non-proliferation regime. You have a state that's outside of the NPT that targets the country within the NPT that has a shady history, but nonetheless is in the NPT. And you see the destruction of nuclear facilities and the targeting of nuclear facilities. And some of the countries that were supportive of the operation were also those that condemned the Russian attacks on Ukrainian nuclear facilities. What this war showed is that there's a lot of hypocrisy in the non-proliferation regime, and countries are going to utilize that to their advantage. And we already see Russia and China trying to do that in the UN when it comes to Iran and compliance with snapback sanctions. It also shows the limits of counterproliferation when you have a very dispersed nuclear program and one that is built deeply underground. And I think that that's something to think about going forward. There's not really countries that parallel the Iran case, but it's very different than the counterproliferation efforts we saw in Iraq or Syria, for example. And I think another big, broader impact here is a challenge of non-weaponized deterrence. You would always hear DC people saying that Iran's a threshold state, Iran has non-weaponized deterrence. I've written about this, that Iran has this shadow pillar of its nuclear program that could potentially be leveraged. It also turned out that wasn't really the case, and that, if anything, Iran simultaneously tried to pursue goals that ended up weakening conventional deterrent, but also the ability to protect its own facilities in its own country from Israeli airstrikes. And that partly has to do with its regional strategy. But Iran was pursuing multiple objectives, all while having this nuclear program that needed to be at least protected, and that Iran was overstretched at the time. And so I think it calls into question whether or not latency or threshold status or non-weaponized deterrence is that useful when it comes to forestalling aggression from a country that has shown to have very little deterrent.
What lessons can be learned from the Iranian nuclear file for nuclear non-proliferation writ large? Azadeh Zamirirad concludes today's episode with her thoughts.
I still think that the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, was a milestone for non-proliferation efforts. And I think the fact that now we are at the point where through snapback, we might eventually see the absolute end of the JCPOA, which will be buried, if you will, through snapback. We should still not forget that this was an effort that was worth taking. And I think it's something where we could actually learn a lot from non-proliferation efforts here. And it's important to note in this context that the JCPOA itself, despite its shortcomings, was actually working. For 3 years that Iran was in the JCPOA, the United States was in the JCPOA, everybody was still complying with its obligations before the Trump administration decided to get out of it. We know through 12 at least IAEA reports that Iran was actually complying with its obligations. Iran's nuclear program was, from a technical perspective, quite severely limited. We had a lot of boots on the ground. We had a lot of verification monitoring measures. So it shows that these kind of arrangements also outside of the NPT can be useful, can be helpful. It also shows that there can be political solutions to nuclear crises and conflicts, that there can be diplomatic efforts that are far more sustainable than these kind of short-term military successes, and I'm putting success in brackets here, provide, where we speak of shorter delays of nuclear activities of maybe 1 to 2 years, maybe more. With the JCPOA, we had at least 10 years, maybe more, of any kind of delay of massive nuclear activities that would have posed a severe or serious challenge. So I think it would be too soon, and I think it would be actually wrong to say the JCPOA had failed and that this is the result of the JCPOA failing. I think the JCPOA was a success of itself, but unfortunately was undermined first by the United States and later massively by Iran. But this does not mean that these kind of non-proliferation agreements outside of the NPT would not be useful or not working. We didn't have the chance to have a long-term view of how this JCPOA and this agreement would have moved forward. I think within the first 3 years, it showed that it can be quite effective. That's one of the lessons. Another lesson that we can take out of the Iran nuclear file is that before the nuclear agreement of 2015, we had years and years of negotiations that didn't produce any tangible results. One game changer was certainly getting rid of this insistence of zero enrichment. But I think overall, the method and the procedure used based on dual track was one, I think, that proved to be successful. That means pressure, sanctions, maybe even potentially military action combined with diplomacy, incentives, and dialogue. And this is something that has been lacking in these latest rounds of escalation in the Iran nuclear file. There were some attempts for negotiations, but they were not seriously protected also and shielded from military attacks and military disturbances. And it's one of the lessons that we should learn from this latest experience, that military attacks on their own, maximum pressure on its own, do not seem to yield the results that are necessary in terms of non-proliferation, that we need different instruments and different aspects also included in order to deal in a sustainable manner with non-proliferation issues as huge as the nuclear file in Iran.
Thank you for listening, our guests for speaking, and the European Union Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium for funding this series. Until next time, stay optimistic.